All right, so today I want to introduce you to all of the allelic combinations in ball pythons. And if you're new to ball pythons and you're not familiar with the term allelic, essentially what it is it acts like a super. And essentially what a super is, it's two of the same co-dominant genes in a single ball python. So for example, if you actually took a super and you bred it to a normal ball python with no genes, you would actually get all single gene animals. You couldn't reproduce the parents, you wouldn't get any supers, and you wouldn't get any normals. And when it comes to allelic combinations, it's kind of the same way as a super, except you have two different genes that come together in the same snake and act like a super. And if you actually took an allelic combination and you bred it to a normal, what you'd actually end up with is 50% of the offspring would have one gene, half the offspring would have the other gene. You couldn't reproduce the parents and you'd get no normals. And when it comes to allelic genes, we like to group them into what we call complexes. And in ball pythons, there's actually 5 different complexes. There's the black-eyed leucistic complex, the blue-eyed leucistic complex, the 8-ball complex, the spider complex, and the yellow belly complex. And in addition to that, there's also some recessive genes that are allelic combinations, which is pretty interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over the internet and I want to show you all these different combinations and all the complexes. I want to pick out some of the more common snakes that you may find at reptile shows that you may not realize are allelic combinations. All right, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com and I want to start with the Ball Python genetic calculator, just so you can see the difference between a super, an allelic combination, and 2 genes that aren't a super or an allelic combination. So I'm going to jump over here and start with the Super Pastel. Super Pastel has 2 of the same genes of a codominant gene, so it's actually super. If you actually take the Super Pastel, you breed it to a normal, 100% of the time you get one thing and one thing only, and that is hatchlings with 1 copy of the pastel genes. You'll have all pastels. You won't have any supers and you won't make any normals. So that's what a super looks like. And if you actually do the same thing with an allelic combination, I actually picked the Lesser Mojave, which both genes are in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. If you actually take a Lesser Mojave, you breed it to a normal, essentially what you'll get is you get 50% Lessers, 50% Mojaves. No normals, and you can't reproduce the parent. I also pulled up this one over here. I put in Pastel and Pinstripe. Pastel and Pinstripe are not allelic and they're not supers. So if you actually took the Pastel Pinstripe, bred it to another snake, you could actually reproduce the parents. This is what you'd see with most genes, I would say, unless you have allelic genes. You'll have 25% of the time pastel pinstripe, 25% of the time pastels, 25% pinstripes, 25% normal ball pythons. So that's the difference between the super, the allelic, and 2 genes that are pretty much unrelated as far as allelics or supers are concerned. So I wanted to start over here with the black-eyed leucistic complex. There's actually 4 genes in the black-eyed leucistic complex, and those are the fire, the sulfur, the disco, and the vanilla. And the black-eyed leucistic complex is named after an all-white snake with black eyes. That's why they call it black-eyed leucistic. And that's pretty much named after the super fire, I think. If you actually take a fire, breed it to a fire, you get a super fire, which is an all-white snake with black eyes. Another thing you can do is work sulfur and fire into the same snake. You get a sulfur fire. So take a look at this. I actually pulled up a sulfur fire over here. And this is pretty interesting because when you add sulfur to the fire, as a matter of fact, if you actually had a super sulfur, a lot of times you get an all-white snake that has blotches of yellow in it. And if you actually have sulfur, you get a lot more yellow. If you have a super fire, you get less yellow. And there's another gene actually called the Lucifer, which is another line of fire that was specifically designed to basically reduce all the yellow on your black-eyed leucistic. So if you have a super Lucifer, you'd have an all-white snake with almost no yellow at all. And again, there's a lot of variability from like a super sulfur to a super sulfur. Sometimes you can get a really super yellow snake, like yellow all on the top, and sometimes you can get some that just have a little bit of yellow. And it's kind of the same thing with the super fire, but I'd say pretty much overall, the more sulfur you have, the more yellow you're going to have. And if you actually make a super fire, most of the super fires don't have that much yellow in them, which is kind of an interesting effect with the 3 different lines of, I pretty much consider the sulfur another line of fire. Here's another one, the Disco Inferno. This one's kind of interesting because it's not a white snake. It's actually a crazy looking snake. So take a look at this. This is the Disco Inferno. This is pretty interesting. It almost looks like a kind of like a highway or a freeway mixed with pied or something like that. It's kind of a wild effect, a really jumbled up pattern. And if you actually look at a lot of the Disco Infernos, they really vary a lot from one snake to another. It was really hard to pick one out compared to all the other ones. Some of them are really orange. Some of them have almost no white at all. Some of them almost look like they have pied in them with really big patches of white in the Disco Infernos. Kind of an interesting effect with the white coming up the side. It's almost like they have really strong ringers, just random ringers coming up, the white coming up the side. Sometimes it goes all the way around. Sometimes in this case, it's pretty extreme. So here's another one I wanted to show you, the Vanilla Cream. I wanted to show you just kind of the more common ones that you'd see at reptile shows. I didn't really want to go through every single combination in this video, or it would be like 3 hours long probably going through all the combinations. But you know, if you go to the reptile show and you see a Vanilla Cream for sale and you're thinking about buying it, you realize that the Vanilla Cream, as well as all these other combinations, are actually allelic combinations. A little bit tougher to work with because if you breed them to something else, you can't reproduce the parent, which a lot of people actually want to do. So take a look at the Vanilla Cream. The Vanilla Cream actually looks really similar to the Disco Inferno, except it uses vanilla instead of disco. And kind of the interesting thing, I went through a whole bunch of Vanilla Creams over here in Morph Market, and it seemed like there was none of them that had any of the white coming up, any of the ringers or the pied look, even white coming up the belly, which is kind of interesting. That's the difference between vanilla and disco. The other thing I found interesting too is on the Vanilla Creams, a lot of them had like almost looks like a bald head on the Vanilla Creams. And if you actually look at the Disco Infernos, kind of has a really strong, interesting pattern on the head. Almost looks like an octopus or something right on the head of the Disco Inferno. And you don't see that on the Vanilla Creams. You'll actually see like a completely washed out head. So if you're walking by a table and you see a snake with no white, with a washed out head that looks kind of crazy like this, you pretty much know it's a Vanilla Cream. And sometimes they just call it cream. Sometimes they call it Vanilla Cream. That's the combination of the vanilla and the fire. All right, so keep in mind also that you can only have 2 genes in any complex in a single snake. So for example, you couldn't have like a vanilla disco fire. It's pretty much impossible. You can only have 2 genes in any one complex in any one snake. So I've actually seen some people, you know, misidentify genes, you know, like combinations over on Morph Market where they're listing more than 2 genes that are in the same complex, in the same snake. And I'm like, that's pretty much impossible. You better do some DNA testing on that snake to figure out what it is, because obviously you can't have more than 2 genes in the same snake. All right, so I'm going to jump over to the yellow belly complex, which is kind of interesting. Obviously, it's named after the yellow belly. There are 5 genes in the yellow belly complex, and those are the yellow belly, the gravel, the asphalt, the spark, and the specter. And basically, a lot of people know the yellow belly, bred with a yellow belly, produces an ivory, which is the super form of the yellow belly. It's an all white snake, kind of a dirty white snake, not completely white. Kind of has a little, almost like someone took some fireplace ash and kind of wiped it on the snake. Sometimes it'll be a little bit. And if you actually have just yellow belly by itself in a lot of combinations, it's a brightening gene, so it can really bring out a lot of the brightness, especially if you mix it with like orange dream and pastel, which is pretty interesting. But if you actually take yellow belly and mix it with gravel, you get a highway. And if you haven't seen a highway, I'd say, I almost got into this project. Take a look at what a highway looks like. This is a crazy looking snake. It looks like, you know, kind of the dotted line going down a highway right down the back of the snake. If you actually work other genes into a highway, you can make some really crazy combinations. There's another combination that's similar to the highway, and that's the freeway. And I don't think the gravel and the asphalt are the same thing. It'll be interesting to see, you know, genetically, if they can actually separate these two genes. I'll have to actually go over and look at the genetic testing to see if, you know, the gravel and asphalt are separate, because, you know, there are some overlaps. There's the gravels that look like asphalts when you mix the, you know, the highways and the freeways. But take a look at what the freeway looks like. I pulled one up over here, and this is kind of interesting because look at how impressive this snake is. And if you were to go to like a reptile show and have all the breeders put one of their highways on the table and lined them all up, if you lined up like 20 highways and 20 freeways, they would all look completely different. You couldn't tell that there are even, you know, the same genes in the snake. There's so much variation. I think it's the variation in the yellow bellies too. Variation in the yellow belly, variation in the gravel, and variation in the asphalt. You can go over here on Morph Market and you can see dozens and dozens of variations. Some of them have like a really high white background with like lightning strikes through them. Some of them are bright yellow. Some of them are kind of faded out. Some of them are orange. There's just so many different variations when you're actually working with this. So if you actually, if I was to get into this project, what I would do is I would go to the reptile show or look on Morph Market and get the two genes together instead of working two genes from separate snakes. So for example, if you actually had a snake with yellow belly and a snake with asphalt, and you bred them together, you don't know what that freeway is going to look like, because, you know, it could be a variation of a lot of different themes working those two genes together in a combination. Then keep in mind, if you actually took this and bred it to something else, you can't reproduce it. You would get half asphalts and half yellow bellies. And a lot of times you can't tell the difference between an asphalt and a yellow belly just by looking at it. So you'd pretty much be stuck with DNA testing all of your offspring from this, you know, working on the yellow belly project. Here's another one I wanted to show you, which is really common at the reptile shows, and that is the puma. And that's the combination of the spark and the yellow belly. I actually pulled up a puma over here, and of course the pumas can be really variable too. I just thought this one was pretty interesting, a spark and a yellow belly. And a lot of the pumas will actually completely wipe out the pattern on the side of the snake, and you'll get this line right down the top of the snake, which is a really interesting effect. Sometimes they can have like this peach color. Sometimes they can have a lot of different colors in your puma. Sometimes the pumas can really be grayed out too, kind of a brownish gray. And sometimes they can be really bright. A lot of variations with the puma. All right, so here's the last one I wanted to show you. If you go to the reptiles show, or, you know, looking over on Morph Market, you may be familiar with the super stripe. Super stripe is a combination of the yellow belly and the specter. And I pulled up a super stripe over here. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is really impressive. Probably one of the most impressive super stripes I've seen, with a really bright, strong line right down the top. Really thick line, like a super stripe on top of the snake, with like a black outline around it. That is pretty wild. And I've actually done a video on the super stripe and all the different stuff that you can make with the super stripe, working other genes into the super stripe combination. Of course, it's a little bit tricky with an allelic combination, because you'd have to breed like a super stripe to another snake that not only contains a lot of other genes, but maybe contains yellow belly or specter, you know, because you'd have to have you could breed like you could have like an ivory with like a whole bunch of other genes in the ivory, and then breed this to the ivory, and you would get super stripes and ivories. You'd get no normals, which would be kind of the cool way to go on some of these combinations. All right, so that was the yellow belly complex. Let's jump over to the black pastel complex, also known as the 8-ball complex. So there are 6 genes in the black pastel complex, and those are the black pastel, the cinnamon, the het red axanthic, the enchi, the huffman, and the razor. And you have to be careful about het red because it's a little misleading, especially for some new people. You know, usually when we're talking about hets, we're talking about a recessive gene like het clown or het axanthic. But in this case, the het red is actually a codominant gene. So you can actually have a super het red axanthic. So that is really confusing for beginners, I would say, looking at codominant genes versus recessive genes. Kind of one of the anomalies in ball pythons. So I actually wanted to show you just a couple over here on some of the combinations. Of course, we have to go over the 8-ball. The 8-ball is the combination of the cinnamon and the black pastel. And take a look at what the 8-ball looks like. It is a jet black snake, really jet black. And sometimes it'll have like a really super white belly too, which is a really interesting effect. And if you're actually working with cinnamon or black pastel, a lot of times you can actually have genetic defects working with those two genes, especially if you work them together and you're working both of them into 8-ball combinations. So a lot of times you'll have different shaped heads. So if you notice the head on this ball python, it actually has kind of a thinner head than a normal ball python, kind of a narrower forehead, I guess you'd say. kind of a shorter top of the head that's kind of not flat like a regular ball python. It has a completely different shape. Sometimes the mouth will kind of stretch out a little bit. They call that duck billing if it stretches out to the side a little bit. And then in some cases, you'll actually have kinking of the spine. So some people kind of avoid this project, and I'm convinced that the kinking is line dependent. So if you breed two snakes together and you get multiple snakes that are kinked, I would not breed those two snakes together, because I've seen some people breeding 8-balls, not having any problems at all. And then sometimes it's just like, you know, defect after defect on certain combinations of snakes on certain lines of the black pastel and the cinnamon. So something to be aware of. So here's another one, the onyx. I actually did a video on the onyx and all the amazing combinations you can do with the onyx. That's the combination of the black pastel and the het red axanthic. Pretty cool project if you want to go to the dark side and take a look at what the onyx looks like. That is a crazy looking snake, a dark snake with some of this coppery color, copper tones in it, with a really strong stripe down the back. And the alien heads kind of get wiped out and scrambled down the side. Kind of the interesting thing, in a lot of combinations, if you work black pastel into your combination, a lot of times it'll have this effect on the alien heads and completely wipe them out and scramble them up on the side of the snake. That's pretty typical of your black pastel. And the het red, and certain lines of het red can really bring in a lot of the coppery color and make it for a really impressive dark coppery color snake, which is pretty awesome. Here's another one you may be familiar with, and that is the gargoyle. The gargoyle is the combination of cinnamon and het red. I pulled a gargoyle up here. This is the gargoyle. It's a dark snake, has a really strong line down the back of the snake, and it kind of jumbles up the pattern again because it has the cinnamon. Sometimes the cinnamon can kind of jumble up the pattern. You can actually see the het red, and not in all cases. The het red sometimes won't bring out that coppery color. Depends on the version of the het red axanthic that you actually have. But look at how dark the head is on this one. Really super dark from that cinnamon, which is pretty crazy. All right, so that's the black pastel 8-ball complex. I wanted to jump over here to a big one. Take a look at this. This is the spider complex with 10 genes in the spider complex. And those genes are the spider, the champagne, the woma, the hidden gene woma, the spot nose, the blackhead, the cypress, sable, the Wookiee, and the chocolate. And one thing you have to be careful of with the spider complex is there's certain lethal combinations that you want to stay away from. So for example, if you actually bred a spider to a spider, 25% of the time, the eggs would not develop because it's a lethal combination. Same thing with spider champagne, or the super champagne, or the super woma. The woma and the hidden gene woma is a lethal combination, and the hidden gene woma and the woma is a lethal combination. So you have to be careful of those. Some of these genes are safe. Some of them lead to head wobble. In some cases, you'll actually have more of a head wobble in the spider, champagne, woma, and hidden gene woma. That basically you won't see in the other combinations. The spot nose, the super spot nose, the powerball, sometimes that can have a wobble too. So you kind of have to be careful of what you're actually working with here. But keep in mind, if you make out any of these combinations, they are all allelic combinations. So I wanted to show you two combinations that kind of stuck out from all these. Obviously, I can't go through all these combinations. It would just take too long. But I wanted to show you this one, the black head with the spider. This one's kind of interesting. This is the combination of the blackhead and the spider. And it's interesting, if you merge blackhead into spider, the blackhead will completely eliminate all the wobble in the spider, so you won't have any wobble. As far as I know, no one's actually produced a blackhead spider that's ever had any wobble. And in some cases, you'll see in this one, you'll actually see a lot of the spider pattern in this one. I'd say a lot of your blackhead spiders, they won't have any spider pattern at all. As a matter of fact, for the longest time, I didn't even think the blackhead spider pattern existed at all until I found this one. And they're like, oh, you can actually produce a blackhead spider with a spider pattern, which is pretty fascinating. And I was actually going over this with someone in my live stream. We were kind of chatting back and forth on how you can actually work with spider and completely eliminate the wobble using blackhead. And we actually figured out a way to do it. So what you could actually do is you could take a blackhead spider, breed it to a super blackhead, and you can actually have other genes in the mix too. But if you had a blackhead spider worked with a super blackhead, essentially what you get half super blackheads and half blackhead spiders. You wouldn't get spider by itself. So that's one way to work with the spider gene to where you could actually work without the risk of a wobble. As a matter of fact, if you had a spider, you could probably breed it to like a super blackhead. That's what I would suggest if you're working with a spider. And then you'd make all blackhead spiders, and then from those blackhead spiders, work it into other super blackhead combinations, and then you could completely eliminate the wobble in your spider project, which is pretty cool. All right, here's another one I wanted to show you. I was looking through all these different combinations, looking for the most impressive visual combination, and I came upon this one, the spot nose and the cypress. Both are in the spider complex. And take a look at what the spot nose cypress looks like. That is a crazy combination. I'd say that's probably the most impressive combination I've seen in the entire spider complex for an allelic combination. So keep in mind, if you actually bred this to something else, you would get 50% cypress, 50% spot nose. And usually cypress by itself or spot nose by itself or in other combinations won't give you any wobble or lethal combinations or anything like that. So this would be a pretty cool project. So a lot of people kind of shy away from all the genes in the spider complex, and I think this is kind of a safe bet going after cypress spot nose, especially mixing other genes in with the cypress spot nose. Okay, so that's the spider complex. I'm going to show you another big one, and that is the blue-eyed leucistic complex. The blue-eyed leucistic complex consists of 10 genes, and those are the bamboo, the lesser, the butter, the russo, the honey, the special, the phantom, the mystic, the mojave, and the mocha. Lots of genes and lots of different combinations they have to be careful of if you're actually picking up a snake at a reptile show thinking you're going to reproduce the parents with some of these combinations. If it's an allelic combination, a lot of times you can't actually do it unless you have the right breeding and the right strategy in your ball python breeding project. But it's kind of interesting. I was looking through a lot of these. They actually figured out that the mystic and the phantom are actually the same gene as far as genetic testing, which kind of throws a wrench into a lot of our naming convention. As a matter of fact, if you actually come over here and take a look at this, the Russo phantom is called the opal diamond, and then the mystic Russo is called the invisible. So I guess according to genetic DNA testing, the opal diamond is equivalent to the invisible, which is pretty crazy. So we have a lot of different names you know, like the phantom crystal or the mystic crystal. Now it's all the same thing. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Yeah, so it gets a little bit confusing. You know, when they do DNA testing, they prove two genes are exactly the same, and then we have all these different names based on the two individual genes, which is pretty fascinating. So I wanted to show you just a few snakes here. Usually a blue-eyed leucistic, when you think of blue-eyed leucistic, you think of an all-white snake with bright blue eyes. And pretty much the best way you can do it with a stark white snake with bright blue eyes is if you actually take a Mojave and work lesser into it. So the lesser Mojave, I actually pulled up a picture over here. Take a look at this. This is the lesser Mojave, and look at how bright that eye is over here. Super bright blue eye. And as a matter of fact, you can actually have probably like 6 or 7 or 8 genes in the lesser Mojave, and none of them will actually break through the white. It's like a really visually dominant white snake that nothing can really break through. And it's a pretty amazing combination. As a matter of fact, a lot of people ask me, how do I make the white snake with no colors at all? I always tell them, use a lesser, breed it to a Mojave, and make the lesser Mojave. Or you could do like a super lesser to a super Mojave, and then you'd like have a whole clutch of lesser Mojaves, which would be pretty fascinating. All right, another one I want to show you is the Mojave Special, which is the crystal. And let me tell you, I almost bought a crystal for my very first Ball Python. As a matter of fact, I almost bought this, I think it was this snake right here. I'm not sure when this one sold, but I was looking at this. I think it was this exact snake when I first started in Ball Pythons. This is a crystal. And look at how beautiful it is. This is actually, I guess you would consider it a blue-eyed leucistic because it has 2 genes in the blue-eyed leucistic complex, but it's not an all-white snake with blue eyes. Doesn't even have blue eyes, which is pretty fascinating that you can make so many different combinations with 2 genes in the blue-eyed leucistic complex. Essentially, it's like a interesting yellow snake and with spots all over it. And when I first got into ball pythons, I was looking at snakes, just kind of looking at the visual appearance of snakes. I was like, man, that's a beautiful snake. I want that snake. I almost bought it. I don't know if I actually emailed the breeder over here in Morph Market, but I almost did, or I did. And then I realized it was an allelic combination. So if you actually bred that to like a normal, you couldn't reproduce it, which is kind of crazy. And then you'd end up with Mojaves and specials if you bred it to something else. So it's a little bit more difficult to actually reproduce the beautiful snake that you actually want to buy. So sometimes that's a consideration as far as buying a snake. Here's another one. This is, you know, pretty much everyone knows the Purple Passion. The Purple Passion is the combination of the Mojave and the Phantom. As a matter of fact, the Phantom and the Mystic is the same. So we used to call the Mystic, well, actually yeah, so I don't know if you could have like a Mystic version of the Purple Passion. So it would be, let me see if I can figure this out in my table here. It wouldn't be this one. It would be the Mystic Mojave. Wait a minute, that can't be right. Mystic Mojave is the Mystic Potion. The Mojave Phantom is the Purple Passion. So I guess the, wait a minute, the Purple Passion is the same thing as the Mystic Potion. Oh wait, it's kind of blowing my mind here that we're doing DNA testing and these snakes are actually the same. Wow, 2 different names. That's crazy. So let me show you what a Purple Passion looks like, which is kind of crazy. This is pretty much the best Purple Passion that I could find over here in Morph Market. Look at how purple that snake is. Really intense with a really strong line right down the top of the snake. And look, it actually wipes out almost all the pattern on the side of the snake, the Purple Passions. A lot of people are really into trying to find the most purple snake, and I'd say Purple Passion is pretty much as close as you can get in ball pythons to getting a purple snake. All right, so that's pretty much it for the blue-eyed leucistic. I wanted to show you one more thing and just a few recessive genes. I don't think we can consider them recessive complexes because it's not really complex. There's just a couple genes that are recessive that are allelic. which is pretty fascinating. One of them is clown and cryptic. So you can actually have a het clown and a het cryptic, which we call a krypton, which is pretty fascinating. Let me show you what a krypton looks like. This is what a krypton looks like, but I've seen some kryptons that didn't look quite like this, that were a little bit kind of muted compared to how impressive this looks. But kind of the power of the krypton is if you actually work it in with other genes, it seems like it almost acts like clown, to where clown is the king of combos for a recessive gene. We actually work other genes, even just pastel into clown. You can make some really crazy combinations, or super pastel. And it's the same thing with the krypton, except it looks even crazier than some of the clowns, a completely different visual appearance. I think I did a video on the krypton with all the different combinations of krypton like 5 years ago, but there's a lot of potential you can do working other genes into the krypton. Here's another one too. This is the albino and the candy. They've proven that the candy and the toffee are the same genes. So it used to be we had candinos and toffinos, and now they're the same thing, the candino and the toffee. Kind of blowing my mind. So essentially what it is you actually have het albino and het candy is a candino, which is one copy of the albino gene, one copy of the candy gene, one copy of the albino gene. So take a look at this. This gets a little bit confusing over here. Especially if you're in the Candino project. So this is a Candino that's just hatched, like a brand new Candino hatchling. And the Candinos look almost exactly like albinos. So the albinos, when they hatch, they have this really stark contrast between the white background and then the yellow color. And then they have like bright red eyes. And the Candinos, sometimes you can kind of pick them out. The eyes are not quite as bright, like a bright red as an albino, but I've actually seen some that are really close. As a matter of fact, I've talked to a lot of people breeding albinos and candinos, and they say the only way you can actually tell the difference is after they start maturing a little bit, after they've had a few meals, because the candino, unlike the albinos that stay like this really white background, the candinos will completely change into a different background. And take a look at this. This is a candino. Het albino, het candy, and you can see the whites turn like a purple color, which is pretty fascinating. I've also heard of some people where they're breeding candies, candinos, and albinos in the same clutch. And they say essentially what happens is they all start looking out like albinos. The candinos won't turn purple in the background as fast as the candies. The candies will turn faster, turn the background purple faster than the candinos. So that's kind of the trick to the project between the albinos, the candies, and the candinos. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And Terry Struble asks, if you have two copies of a recessive gene, it's a visual, so there's no super form, correct? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, we kind of have our own terminology in ball pythons. We call two copies of recessive gene a visual, two copies of a codominant gene a super. But as a matter of fact, if you actually took a shed from your ball python and you send it in to get tested, they would report it as one copy of the gene. They would say it's heterozygous for that gene. Two copies of the gene would be homozygous. So I guess you would say we kind of have our own lingo that's been passed down over the years breeding ball pythons. It's a little bit different than you'd see in your typical biology. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.